Good afternoon. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you all here this afternoon. My name is Reverend Andrew Black. I'm the founder of Earth Keepers 360, which is a nationwide movement working to equip, engage, and educate spiritual leaders and tribal leaders all over the United States to be engaged on modern environmental issues. So super grateful that you all are joining us for this live webinar with Father John Deere and some amazing speakers. And Earth Keepers, of course, is honored to host today's conversation entitled "We Are Our Children's Future: Living the Radical Alternative of Peace, Justice, and Environmentalism in Times of Crisis." Today's title, of course, comes from the recognition that while we often lift up children as our future, the inverse is also true. That what we do today in terms of peace, justice, and environmental action will impact the future of our children and the world that they live in. I'm a father of a 3-year-old. And I wake up every day thinking about what I am doing to the world and how that'll impact my daughter's reality. So before we begin our program today, I've asked Earthkeeper spiritual advisor and Jemez Pueblo traditional leader, Joseph Brophy Toledo, to offer an opening blessing. Brophy, would you mind unmuting yourself and offering a blessing for today's event and program?
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and everybody that's involved in this Zoom meeting today. My name is Joseph, preferably Brophy Toledo, Pueblo of Jemez. I'm a spiritual leader. I am also a traditional healer. I do a lot of work with a lot of the youth over here with our youth leadership programs. Today, I want to offer a prayer on behalf of everybody that's united in this effort in environmental issues, environmental justice, and Earth People Move. I'll be doing it in my Toa language, so I'm going to begin. Hedina shetoye tawe sheye kwala shona kwala shopokuna any dabo olo nom ne toko songon olo akishuli umpike kyo tawe seoge ede ono apeke takwa hikwe dala olo nom pa walking kwa sonjo ne tawe olo pecho kwa non ne pe wa tawe olo pa kwa non tawe olo kwa ki kwa shile tawe dabo olo we home tawe olo gata mu tawe olo bakwa ne kwe tawe dabo olo wa belo olo ompa olo man shine olo no me takwa sangana olo open la shine o se yo le shile wa le shile kin de kis le hun shile to a shuse wa olo kwe ten se ten that thing I down shu ne kwa hi lo pe le shu ne pe ne kwa ki quello ne dabo ole ton olo no me olo sa kwa mi dabo hini nunda no me o sa kwa lo kwa ina ita quello no me no do kwa ke bulo po ita quello ne do kwa ke ha o no porque que no que no que bu me e te son te no ni ampa hopa na te que ne ao ya de no como do como o quinto ton ita dabo olo shu ton tante na olo pe pokwa non se top non no me pe ve kwa shi pe puma kwa hono eta e son te no in apa hopa na te in pe te kwe de non gum dog kwa kai o no puken to da bata kwala shu na kwala shu kana o se le kwe pi shi mi eta va o lo ki to ton le ta no me pe ve kwa shi pe da ba no me kwa ke pa da shi ta se ton se ze ta va ze min se chu ki che mi le. Thank you. My prayer today was just thanking our God, our Creator, who invented all Earth people. And our job in this world is to take care of Mother Earth, as we call it in our native tongue. The world we call Mother Earth, the heartbeat of Mother Earth, and all the rhythm that's on Mother Earth. We want to set that at a balance where all the comforts set on Mother Earth first, then Earth people, as we are grounded, generates that one heartbeat from Mother Earth that everybody jointly goes in with that same heartbeat. That's one of our traditional jobs that we do here in our Pueblo world, because Earth people were created to take care of Mother Earth. And we always are permissive in everything that we're doing. We educate our youth with their own self identity on who we really are as Earth people. we all have that one God that we all pray to, but we all have different ways that we do it. But we all pray to that one God. So unitedly, Earth people, we belong together. Thank you.
Thank you, Brophy. Brophy and I have been doing work with Earth Keepers for well over a decade, and he was part of a group that I led with interfaith leaders to Bears Ears National Monument, including Sister Joan. And it was just great to have you on, Brophy, and thank you always for keeping us spiritually grounded. Today, we obviously have a great conversation. We've got some of my favorite people lined up. You already heard one of them. We've got Sister Joan Brown, who's the Executive Director of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light and a Franciscan. We have Jorge Sayago-Gonzales, who is a chaplain working with youth in Miami, Florida, who's also a social justice advocate and the host of Journey Talks podcast. And then, of course, we have Father John Deere with us. Just to give a little bit of an introduction for Father John, he's an internationally acclaimed author of over 35 books, a peace advocate nominated by, of course, Archbishop Desmond Tutu as for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was also the Red Cross's lead chaplain at Ground Zero after 9/11, working and ministering to many of the families there. Father John's done nonviolence work literally all over the U.S., but also all over the world. He's lived with refugees in a camp in El Salvador. He's worked for a human rights center in Northern Ireland, taken a group of Nobel Peace Prize winners to Iraq, and led an interfaith delegation to Israel and Palestine. So all of this, of course, is done while standing in solidarity and working with communities that have been facing war and gun violence and environmental injustices. So, Father John, I got to hear you preach yesterday at our church here at First Presbyterian Church of Santa Fe, and want to welcome you back to New Mexico, back to your old stomping grounds, and just curious about what you've been up to lately and what you're doing back here in New Mexico.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for having me, and thanks everybody for being here, and hello to my friend, Sister Joan, and thank you for all your great work, Joan, and my new friend, Jorge. Thank you for your great work in Miami, and everybody, thank you for all you do for, as Brophy said, Mother Earth and creation, and thank you for Earth Keepers. You give us all hope to inspire us. Seriously, yeah. Well, I'm traveling around the country causing trouble, speaking out, and talking about Jesus and nonviolence as one does. And, you know, we all are trying to do whatever we can in this bad time to wake the country up and to wake people of faith up, to step up and take action and say no to all the destruction and poverty and war and violence that's going on at every level, and to lift up a vision of peace and justice and nonviolence. So I wrote this book called The Gospel of Peace, and I'm traveling around the country talking about it. It's a commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, from a perspective of nonviolence. So I'm trying to show how in every line of the Gospels, Jesus is even more nonviolent than Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi. It's just a way to help us all, especially Christians, because we're all so crazy, to reclaim the nonviolence of Jesus, and to help us become people of nonviolence, like Gandhi and Dr. King and so many great people have taught us. Can I say one other thing? Since we're with Earth Keepers, it's kind of a follow-up on a book I did a couple years ago called They Were the Inherit the Earth. And I didn't know that. And this is what, if you ask me what would my message be to everybody, it's just so shocking that 2,000 years ago, Jesus said in the third sentence of the Sermon on the Mount, his greatest teachings on nonviolence, Gandhi said the greatest teaching on nonviolence in the history of the world. Jesus said, blessed are the meek, which is the biblical word for Gandhian, Kingian, active nonviolence. They will inherit the earth. In other words, Jesus was saying, active creative nonviolence leads to oneness with creation. So we rejected nonviolence long ago, and we're not one with creation. And part of our work, as Earth Keepers, is to return to that vision of nonviolence that Jesus upheld, that all the religions uphold, and to return to oneness with creation, as Brophy led us in prayer.
Amen. Amen. So The book that John's referring to, his latest book tour is John Deere, The Gospel of Peace. It's a great book. Anybody who's, especially pastors and spiritual leaders that want to have a full commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's an excellent book. We've actually been leading a course on it here at First Presbyterian Church. Pastor Harry's been kind of working on leading that through adult education. So it's a really good study book as well for congregations and communities. And then, of course, the other book that John mentioned was They Will Inherit the Earth. Really love this book, especially if you're into kind of discussions about New Mexico, Yosemite, all over the country, and kind of how that's influenced your creation understanding. So highly recommend both books to our audience. With that said, I wanted to go ahead and dig into some of the questions that the audience submitted. So as you all know, many of the people who signed up and registered for this submitted questions. We selected 4 questions from the audience, and there's certainly an opportunity if you all want to submit other questions into the group chat for Zoom. Go ahead and feel free to do that. But the 4 questions that were selected by us that came from registrants are these. And let me start with the first one. The first question that came was, what are the principles of nonviolence? And what do you see as the opportunity and challenges of teaching nonviolence to youth in different generations? John, I want to start with you, and then I'd love to hear from Sister Joan and Jorge on that question.
It's such a great question. Wow. Well, Mahatma Gandhi used this clumsy word to describe, well, ahimsa originally meant do no harm in thought, word, or deed. Well, that would be enough to go on for the rest of our lives. You're never going to hurt another human being ever. You're never going to say anything that's going to hurt another human being ever. You're never going to think anything that's going to hurt another human being ever. But then over time, we've broadened it to mean, well, universal love and pursuit of the truth of our common unity. As Brophy says, we're all one with one another, but the creatures and Mother Earth could never hurt any human being, much less a creature, Mother Earth, or be silent in the face of war, poverty, nuclear weapons, fossil fuels, destruction of the planet. So it's a whole new way of life now. It's a spiritual path, but it's also a political methodology of transforming the culture of violence into something we've not yet seen yet, a new culture of nonviolence. I always think of Dr. King the night before the government killed him. His last public words really were, the choice is no longer violence or nonviolence. That's not what we're talking about. It's nonviolence or non-existence. That was 1968. Here we are in the face of catastrophic climate change, closer to nuclear war than ever, in a world of permanent warfare led by the United States, with 5 billion people in unimaginable poverty rushing toward non-existence. So I'm still struggling to figure out what Gandhi and Dr. King meant by this word, but I would say we have to all try to define it, figure out how to be nonviolent to ourselves, nonviolent toward every human being on the planet and the creatures and Mother Earth. But then we also have to be part, as Gandhi and King showed, even going back to Jesus, of the bottom-up people power grassroots movements of nonviolence. And that's what Earth Keepers is trying to do. In other words, it's not enough now to just live a quiet, peaceful life. We all have to get involved as human beings, as our children's future, as you said so well, to be the people who finally do what Martin wanted, to lead humanity back from the brink of non-existence. We can do it if we claim our power. So Martin Luther King, if he were sitting here, he would define nonviolence as power. The culture of death and destruction says, there's nothing you can do. It's too bad. It's a shame. You're powerless. You should be despairing. There's nothing you can do. That is completely the opposite of all the spiritual teachings, all the religions, and the meaning of active, creative nonviolence. We have the power, if we claim political will, to join together. And what we need, friends, and what you're all trying to do, even to the last day, each one of us of our lives, is to build a global grassroots people power movement of nonviolence, the likes of which the world has never seen. We have to go way beyond Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King and all the movements have to come together. And I'm hoping all of you can unpack how we're going to do that, but for the sake of our children and the creatures in Mother Earth.
Amen. Well, Sister Joan, Jorge, do you all want to kind of add to John's answer and your thoughts on that, reflecting on that a little bit? Go ahead, Joan.
Sure, I'll jump in. And John, you certainly gave a small task there, didn't you, for all of us to do? So I was just chuckling about that. But, really, I think this is an opportunity moment to maybe revisit the meaning of what nonviolence is and to come at it from a deeper place even. I look at ahimsa as the path of harmlessness. So it is a path. And to me, that speaks of an evolutionary process, a process of transformation. And I think in the past, we've looked at things in a sort of a duality kind of way, even the term nonviolence. I think to reframe that in kind of this human path, a recreation of who we are as human beings. Brophy talked about balance in his prayer, one heartbeat. I think to look at that whole area of relationships, growing deeper in relationships, transformation, to move through that which seem like obstacles, but really are a path to greater wholeness and a deeper love, which is the physical, the actual physical structure of the universe. I've been in several conversations with young adults, and I think Jorge's going to mention or talk about some of this too, where I was confronted. These young folks said, you're out of touch, by using that term or even saying nonviolence, because, I'm a person of color, and just walking down the street, people think of violence. So I think our times are calling us to look at a lot of things in new ways with new eyes and to go deeper into that in order to be part of one another in creating the beloved community that we all long for. And so, Jorge, I'll let you jump in.
Thank you, Sister Joan, and thank you, Father John, as well. Listen, this is so enriching, right? I've been working with children for the most of the past 9 years. Prior to that, I was a youth pastor working with youth and young adults. And I've been mesmerized by the ways in which these narratives of spiritual formation seem to feel so distant from the reality that our children face every single day, right? And so I've always been curious about how is it that we can provide children to have access to the wisdom that they have from within. The scripture reminds us, one of the beautiful promises of the gospel is that we're all God's children, right? So we've been created in the image of God. And so, but luckily we also have new language, psychological language that helps us perhaps reinforce those principles. And so there's this concept of self-regulation that I have been vacillating lately, because we have this beautiful teachings of nonviolence, but how can we respond to perhaps those initial body reactions that we have to the fear, the insecurity that so many people live in, right? And so this concept of nonviolence, I think, should be rooted. I'm curious if it's rooted also in this ability that we have to access that inner peace, right? The scriptures reminds us of the peace that surpasses all understanding. But how are we equipping children and young folks to act out of that place instead of from a reactionary perspective, right? And so I'm curious to hear more about how, in a world that we have so many distractions, where we have so much power in our hands with our devices and all these different things, how can we continue to promote an access of the indwelling presence of God within us, right? And how we cultivate and plant those seeds so these future generations, right, can grow up understanding that when we act and we recognize that shared humanity, we're setting the pavement, right? We're setting the ground for perhaps healthier future conversations and an opportunity to recognize that beautiful gift of living together as human beings. I don't know. Those are my initial thoughts, and I'm curious to hear more about perhaps what you might have to say, Father John or Andrew, in regards to that, because the call for action for nonviolence is such a high calling, right? But I feel like it, after working with kids, I feel like it needs to come from a very deep place within us, where we have access to understand that wisdom from within, that it's a gift from God. I'm just throwing some thoughts out there.
So Father John, I mean, this is reminds me a little bit of a question we talked about yesterday, which is we live in a culture of violence, right? We live in a school system where kids are taught from the earliest age about gun violence. And so I'm really, my sense is in that so many of us have not even understood how much that culture of violence has impacted us, shaped us, conditioned us in a lot of ways. So I'm really curious if you would talk for a second, Father John, about what are some of the spiritual practices that have helped you cultivate a life of nonviolence? What does that look for you? Yeah, what does that look like for you? Because it takes active work. Right? It's not something that I think just is in this society and the way we're raised, the way we're shaped. I think a lot of that gets distorted. And so what have you done to help deconstruct that culture of violence in your own life? And how do you kind of keep yourself honest with your own spiritual practices?
Wow. Great questions. Still thinking about Sister Joan and Jorge talking about young people. Just a word on that. Having done so many different things around the country and the world, I am a broken record, and I know I'm an old guy, but I have found that the thing that has worked most best with youngest people to high school people to college people, and I don't know that you'll agree with me, is, and I'm a big name dropper, I talk about Jesus and I talk about nonviolence. And that's so confusing. But young people seem to get it. So, for example, when I talk with them, I'm thinking of all the parishes I've ever worked in among very poor people. To them, to be really nonviolent, hey, you're going to need God, and you're going to have to figure out new ways. They're learning the gospel. And by the way, we have an example of how to do that in the life of Jesus. I've seen the light go on in hundreds, if not thousands, of young people. For me, it's an ongoing way of life. It's a journey of discipleship to Jesus, but that would mean for me my own personal practice of daily meditation. Gandhi did 2 1-hour meditations every day, and he was a busy guy. He was running a revolution. So lately I've been trying to do that too, especially in the pandemic, but I was raised to do 1 hour in the morning. The kind of thing Jorge was talking about. And, to sit with God. Why we don't want to do that is because your violence comes up inside you. And my friend Henry Nouwen talked about that too. That's why people don't want to meditate. But that's the good stuff, Henry would say. You get to give all the wounds, hurts, bitterness, what? Violence, resentments, anger, worry, fear, ego. Let it all go. Give it all to God. Whatever the roots of violence are with you, you're from your self-will to controlling others to your violence toward yourself. And let the God of peace give you the gift of peace. And let the God of peace disarm your heart. That's a daily practice for me. I would be probably completely insane if I didn't do that. And then, to have community and friends. And my teacher was Daniel Berrigan, and he said, you have to find people to pray with and march with and to practice nonviolence with. If you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. So I'm always engaging in public action, usually involves civil disobedience and breaking the law, which legalizes the destruction of the earth or other, as you do. Jorge's. Anyway.
Keep going.
Yeah.
So does that answer your question?
Yeah. So, and one of the things I noticed about you, John, and Richard Rohr talks about this. He always has this line, and I think it was from Gerald May that he's quoting about. There's a holiness you can trust as someone who takes God seriously and not themselves seriously at all. You're one of the more funny, humorous people I've gotten a chance to meet, and also a very holy person. Humor has to play a role in that, right?
I don't know about holy, but when I was a kid and I started out all of this, I was so naive. I went to meet all the great people, And they all took me really seriously because they saw that I was sincere. How do you spend your life working for the end of war? And I put that question to Coretta Scott King and Mother Teresa and the Berrigans and Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh, and they all went with me. But I saw that these people who were changing the world, who had suffered tremendously, had found a way beyond anger and way beyond fear and way beyond anxiety and worry. They were people of tremendous faith. I've not figured out the language to describe these great friends of mine. And as well as the very poor in refugee camps I've met around the world who have a faith I don't understand. It's a trust in God and a nonviolent Jesus. And therefore, you just go forward. And they cultivated, like Tutu, grief and joy. And, Joan Baez says Martin Luther King was the funniest person she ever knew. And every one of Gandhi's friends say he was the funniest person they ever knew, but they're in a constant death threat. So we here in the States are so mixed up in so many ways in all our religious traditions. I think we have to recultivate not only being peaceful to ourselves and our relationships and reclaiming the nonviolence in all our religious traditions, but we have to rediscover the emotional life of nonviolence. Let go of fear and anger. That's not going to help you sustain you to work to end climate change, the destruction of the earth, but also to reclaim how to grieve creatively, spiritually, and also to practice joy and to love life. I'll end with this. Daniel Berrigan told me when I was 21, John, you're going to spend your life like me, resisting the forces of death and destruction. You better learn how to love life to the full.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Love that. Jorge, do you want to ask the second question that was submitted? And just for folks online, feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We've pre-selected 4 questions for our panel to kind of discuss, but we'll see if we have some time to get to some of the ones you submit at the end. And Jorge, go ahead and kick us off with the second question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Father John, the next question we have is, what are the environmental impacts, both hidden and more obvious, of American militarism and the production of nuclear weapons, given the heated temperature that we have lately going on? What are your thoughts on that?
I think you all ought to talk about that first. I've just spoken to you guys. Why don't we let you and Sister Joan and Jorge, and then I can add to it.
I'll give it some initial 2 cents of things. I don't know if folks got a chance to read. There was an article a month ago in the Atlantic, and it was entitled "Military Emissions Are Too Big to Keep Ignoring." The American military is the single largest consumer of petroleum in the entire world. The carbon footprint of our military has more total emissions than the entire continent of Africa. And the Department of Defense estimates that there's 51 million metric tons of CO2 put out by the military in 2021. That's greater than the nation of Sweden just by our own military. This doesn't even include defense contractors. It doesn't include, nuclear weapons manufacturing and the labs. So what's really interesting in reading that article, highly suggested to folks, again, it's the military emissions are too big to keep ignoring by the Atlantic. I think there's 2 things that really stuck out to me about that article. Not only were those staggering facts staggering, but I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was how often the military tried to be exempted from different treaties and different accords and different agreements signed at the global level to not be counted as part of the United States emissions. And so it's really hard to get a sense of that. It's really hard to get data for that. And I think there's kind of been an intentional avoidance of producing that data, of course. And I think the other thing that really struck me about that article is, we're not just talking about jets and jet fuel. I mean, we're talking about nuclear submarines. We're talking about weapons facilities. We're talking about, military bases that are not only in this country, but all over the world. And so the scope and scale of the impacts to climate from our military are massive. And it's really interesting because, Father John knows this. And one of the things I've kind of been working on a lot here in New Mexico is working on LANL issues. Los Alamos National Labs, for folks who aren't familiar with that term LANL, Los Alamos National Labs, of course, many of you may have even seen the movie Oppenheimer. It was home to the making of the atomic bomb. Father John's had a lot of interesting stories and run-ins, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit of that from him today. But Los Alamos National Labs, one of the things that's a little bit of the hidden impacts, Jorge, that you're talking about, are right now trying to run a massive transmission line, an electric transmission line across the Caja del Rio. So for folks that aren't familiar, the Caja del Rio is 106,000 acres of U.S. Forest Service and BLM land right outside of the city of Santa Fe. It's just south of the city of Santa Fe. But it's one of the most remarkable landscapes in the American Southwest in our entire country. So, what is the Caja del Rio, and why is this important that they're trying to run this giant power line across it? The Caja del Rio, if I were to try to explain it, just, imagine what was originally a wildlife migration trail. Yeah. Became a Pueblo footpath over hundreds and thousands of years. And that same Pueblo footpath, thousands of years later, became the famed El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, right? The longest trade route that ran from Mexico City to Wingate Pueblo in northern New Mexico. Bringing in kind of Spanish colonialism, culture, religions, foods, all kinds of things that shifted the reality and identity of this country. Then a couple hundred later, that same trade route became New Mexico Highway 1 and the vie for statehood of this state, and how it was a big engineering feat for our state of New Mexico. But it also ultimately became Route 66 and the mother road coming out of the Great Depression and World War I, and this idea of hope and westward expansion. All of that history is alive on the Caja del Rio. But the other thing that's alive on the Caja del Rio is literally life and wildlife. So it's home to black bear, cougar, incredible amount of badgers, all kinds of elk, deer, but also it's an important bird area. It's got golden eagle, bald eagle, peregrine falcon, burrowing owls, you name it, it's on there. And it's also got incredible desert songbirds that are only found at much lower elevations and in warmer climates. But we have it right here in northern New Mexico at an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet. So the Caja is really important to how wildlife also move in the face of climate. The Climate Atlas says that the Caja del Rio is one of the most important places to protect in the United States for its ecological values. And what's really interesting to me, Jorge, on your question, is the Department of Defense and the National Intelligence Committee have come out and said that climate change is one of the biggest threats to the United States, that climate change is going to impact all of the different parts of the Department of Defense. And so here you have Los Alamos National Labs, in the name of security and in the name of defense, trying to construct a transmission line that'll cut down thousands of trees, destroy wildlife, impact cultural sacred areas from, folks like Brophy's people, all kinds of pueblos in northern New Mexico, all for more power to the national labs. And it's really amazing that it's happening. And of course, they're tapping into an electric substation that's based on fossil fuels. So you have not only the devastation and destruction of the land that's bringing power to the labs, but also tapping into fossil fuels that are coming from the Four Corners area of New Mexico. And one of the things I've said to folks is that the Caja del Rio is a really important landscape to understand the identity of our country. It's a really important landscape from a wildlife perspective. But it's a landscape that deserves our protection and not our dissection. I mean, we need to be restoring this landscape, not destroying it. And I feel like Los Alamos National Labs in particular are making this area a sacrifice zone. A lot of communities in northern New Mexico already feel that way about lots of different areas and sacred lands. And one thing that I've been working to try to push the labs, and John, you'll like this, is one of the, obviously innovators of the labs was Einstein. And he talks about no problem shall be solved by the same level of consciousness that caused it. I feel like Los Alamos National Labs is using the same problem or the same level of consciousness that created the problem, right? They're just trying to mow down an area that they see as a desert plateau to run traditional forms of power. They're not thinking outside the box. They're not using their, ingenious capabilities to come up with more renewables, to think about the impacts of climate, to look at how that impacts national security. They're just doing the same old thing the same way they've always done it. And that's incredibly concerning to me. And I think, these are some of the hidden impacts of what you see with the Department of Defense. And my wife, who's a scientist, pointed out to me, and one of the things to kind of be flippant, but I think it's true, is these are world-class scientists. These are people who literally understand how to create plutonium, how to move nuclear elements all across the world and take those nuclear elements and put them in a warhead but they cannot figure out how to transmit electricity in a way that doesn't destroy our public lands, our cultures, our water, our wildlife. And to be very flippant, I said, Ben Franklin with a kite and a key could figure that out. These folks are not challenging themselves to think outside the box. They're just doing things the same old way. So, that I wanted to talk about that because that public comment period is now open. It's obviously an issue that's important in New Mexico, but nationwide. And folks can comment on that power line and kind of the need to oppose it. I think Jen is going to put in the chat the link where you can kind of oppose that power line. But that comment period is open till the 20th of this month. And one of the things that was really disturbing, John, and I think as a spiritual leader, you'll find this interesting. Originally, Los Alamos National Labs opened the comment period, and it was only a 30-day period on December 19th. Right over the middle of religious holidays, right over the middle of Pueblo feast days, right over the middle of Pueblo selecting new governors and elected leaders, and they only gave the public 30 days to comment. So I've been part of a group of spiritual leaders and part of a bigger coalition that asked our congressional delegation to make sure that period was extended so that the Pueblos could weigh in, so the public could weigh in, so religious leaders could weigh in about how important and sacred this landscape is. But it's a big challenge. I mean, we're up against the National Nuclear Security Administration, and their mentality is national security trumps everything else. So your public lands, your water, your wildlife aren't important. And of course, we're trying to raise the point that what is the point of national security if we lose all of those things? But Joan, I know you work a lot on national lab issues. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say, and I'd love to hear John's reflections back to all this.
Yeah, thanks for that great overview. And, many of you here in the state, know how we call a lot of the state sacrifice zones. And so it's not just those, big and obvious issues, but it's a lot of legacy issues as well, and legacy concerns. And just to give a few stories to kind of share that. So I'm part of a group, Communities for Clean Water, that works on the water situation, and actually was successful in suing Lano for violation of the Clean Water Act. And that's polluted water, of course, from all of the over 1,000, canyons where disposal was placed over the decades. But just continuing to monitor and address those effects to human health and to earth health, to aquifer health, to sister water, to creatures. And then there's others, like we work with, as a solidarity group with MACE, the Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment, the Grants Uranium Mining Belt. And so the uranium mining legacy is huge. And those folks there are living with health concerns, genetic concerns. The water is polluted in many areas. The land is. That affects the creatures. It affects everything again. And then what to do with all of this waste and how to dispose of it. And then that causes more conflicts because those communities that are living with it try to come up with some sort of solution. They've been working, one of the communities, Redwater Pond, has been working on this for 40 years, over 40 years, and they still are, and trying to figure out how do we address this. And then we have the relationship of nuclear power to the whole nuclear fuel chain and military chain. And we just passed after a number of years, a law in the legislative session last year to saying New Mexico does not want Holtec, which it would be a nuclear waste facility for all the spent nuclear rods from all the nuclear power plants around the entire country in southeast New Mexico. And New Mexicans came together and said, we do not want this. It still has been approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and but it's continued to be fought. So another example is that's more hidden also, so that we have these fires in New Mexico, which are increasing because of climate change. And one of the very, very large fires that we had around the labs, really devastated the sacred lands forests of the Santa Clara and San Ildefonso Pueblos. And I still remember, and it brings me to just great pause and sadness, that the men from Santa Clara went to the streams to take their native fish, to take them down to the fisheries to protect them in the Mescalero Apache down in Ruidoso area in those mountains till they could bring them back, because all of the firefighting efforts were to keep the fire from getting Los Alamos because of the contamination, because there were, hundreds of barrels of nuclear waste that are still sitting in basically canvas tents around Lanel, and the fires came very close. So their lands, their heritage, their sacred sites were sacrificed for that. So there are so many, and then you multiply that around the world. But yeah, but those are just a few thoughts around this. Yeah, the impacts, there's a lot of hidden, unknown, and the more obvious as well. Jorge, why don't you go next?
I think it's time. I want to hear from Father Joan on his remarks on this. Just so let me just to give some context. I grew up in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, it's truthfully a colony of the United States, and I was surrounded by military bases, and it's very interesting when you see things in front of you, but no one takes the time to educate you. You continue to perpetuate ignorance, and you create a gap of the realities that are going on. I am so thankful for my theological training that gave me an opportunity to really understand more complexities and see how sometimes most people live and sort of like blinded from nuances that some agencies just wants us to keep us ignorant about. And the truth is that there's always prophets. Biblically, the prophet is not someone that foretells the future, but as theologians, the prophet is someone that brings back the word of God to the people, so we can awake to that collective consciousness that lifts up, the beauty of who we are as God's children. And so I'm very curious to hear, Father Joan, what are your remarks, because you have been more involved in these dialogues and this important cause. So I'll be very curious to see what you have to say about it.
Well, thank you, Jorge. I'm thinking of Vieques. I was part of that struggle in the 90s.
Indeed.
Well, the purpose of any military is to kill. The purpose of every military, every weapon, every bomb is to bring death and destruction. And so the old St. Francis talked a lot about this. He says, if you're going to have if you have a big house and a lot of possessions, you'll need a fence and you'll need some weapons, because the poor are going to want it. We own nothing, so we're nonviolent and at peace with everyone. You apply Francis's logic to the world. The United States, for example, is 4.7% of the world's population, and we continue to steal 60% of the world's resources. You're going to need a lot of big weapons to protect what we've stolen from the poor of the earth and from the earth itself. So we have these big weapons, and just to state the obvious, by the way, war and militarism destroy Mother Earth. We have exploded 1,500 nuclear weapons in Nevada. No one talks about that. All that radioactive particles are floating around the country and the world. We're all wondering why we have an epidemic of cancer. And we have this footprint, 800 military bases around the planet. Besides the cost and the destruction of the environment, you begin to see that it's just global domination, which is exactly what the 1% is trying to do. The super rich of our country and the world, and you need a lot of weapons to maintain what we've done, and you have to be willing to kill a lot of children to do all that, to keep it going like that. And of course, Mother Earth is going to be destroyed. We were serious about Jesus, Gandhi, and Dr. King and becoming totally nonviolent. We have to connect the dots in ways we've never done before. Really, each one of us, especially now as we're all getting older, if you're talking about we are our children's future, we have to just let everything go and really rise to the occasion and become people of total nonviolence and stop fooling around. and tell everyone in our congregations and around the country, quit the military. Don't work at Los Alamos. Don't spend your life building bombs to vaporize people, much less destroy Mother Earth or harm these beautiful places that you're talking about, not to mention the sixth extinction and all the creatures, that those days are coming to an end. And that's the vision that we want to pursue, a vision of nonviolence. And then we're going to connect the dots. There's so much to say, Jorge. I don't even know where to begin, but I'll just tell you one story because I was so involved in protests and vigils at Los Alamos. Some of the Black Lives Matter leaders came to me and wanted to have me talk with them.
Mm-hmm.
So we stood outside the labs and I said, "Oh, you're against racism?" "Yeah, here it is." "You're against white colonialism?" "Here's the epitome of it, the end of the world." "You're against war and destroying people?" "Yeah, here it is, the epitome." "You're against destroying Mother Earth?" This is it. The bomb is just total insanity. And what we were trying to get at is we all have to connect the dots and see that the whole system of violence is about bringing death, good things to death. What we're really up against is death itself. And you and I have to stop all of this and really renounce militarism and its connection with racism and greed that leads to poverty. And the fact that people could just go ahead, that we as a human race could be willing to destroy the planet with our 13,000 nuclear weapons now and the fossil fuels that are bringing us to this. So wherever people are, everything has to change. In our own lives, we have to connect the dots and talking about a whole new vision of a culture of nonviolence, where we have nonviolent, non-military ways of resolving conflict globally, internationally, locally, where we create nonviolent communities, nonviolent countries, a nonviolent world. And we return toward policies that don't harm the earth, that protect the earth and the creatures, and that stop spending all our money on these insane weapons. That it's all connected. And we need to choose life, not death. These are some thoughts, Jorge, that come to my mind. I don't know where to begin. And that's why we all have to keep pondering these questions, but not get caught in the despair of them, but to find hope in the God of peace who's leading us out of this culture of war and death, and to take action to welcome a new world of peace. Things like that.
And I'll pick up a question from the chat. There was a mention from Ibarra. I think I know who that is. Some of the folks that do immigration work down in El Paso, raising kind of the need for more sustainable buildings on bases and kind of the Green Council. I think that's a great point in the chat. And that idea of, one of the challenges I've seen is there were bigger initiatives pushing towards this with Department of Defense installations, Los Alamos National Labs to be more green. And a lot of those feasibility studies were done years ago. There were some steps taken towards them, and then those feasibility studies around green, energy, green buildings and stuff like that were kind of put on the shelves and forgotten about. And so it switches based on the presidential administration. A lot of the times I've seen, with national labs here at Los Alamos, they did a study back in, years ago, over a decade ago, and they haven't revisited that, but they'll still rely on that study as to why they want to put that power line in. Right. So you're dealing with decades old studies and new technology on green building and green technology, but they're still citing, studies that are decades old as to why they can't do it. So that's a great point. And I appreciate that. In the chat. Joan, want to go to you with your question.
Yeah. I'm glad we're talking about the intersectionality of concerns and connecting the dots. So one of the greatest challenges, if not the greatest challenge in some of our perspective right now, nationally, but globally and in the whole universe, is climate change. And it's causing, people and animals and even plants to immigrate. And so I think it's important to, in this conversation about connecting the dots, how do we kind of see those connections with migration, immigration, and nonviolence, or the path of harmlessness and the environment? So I'm just going to open it to all of you.
Yeah,
Go,
Joan, it's such a powerful question. Because isn't the heart of nonviolence, you're a Franciscan, to see every human being as your very sister and brother, that we're all one, that we're already reconciled, that we're already given the peace, the gift of peace. And the deeper you go, and all the religions say this, and all the indigenous peoples, and the deeper you go into that, you realize we're one with the creatures and Mother Earth and the water and the air and the sky. So every human being's your sister and brother. And so we especially side with all the poor, with those in need. We would want to be welcoming everyone, making sure everybody has housing, good food, clean water, jobs, education, healthcare, dignity, every human being on the planet. But well, I don't know the statistics. I've heard there's maybe 60 to 70 million migrants right now on the planet and refugees. But with climate change, by the end of the century, we're going to have 600 to 7 million, 600 million to 700 million refugees. And the poverty is going to increase dramatically. Maybe there are, some would say, dozens of wars. The National Catholic Reporter recently said there's 110 conflicts in the world right now. But where we're headed toward is like a whole planet in total conflagration of war, the use of nuclear weapons. So everything is connected. That's what I'm trying to say. And you see it at the border of New Mexico and Texas and Arizona, where the climate is being destroyed, where sisters and brothers are being turned away and harmed and shipped off because they're being shot and killed by in wars that we started or are responsible for. And everything has to change. That's why I'm talking about a whole new vision of nonviolence that Jesus talked about, that Gandhi and Dr. King talked about, the way we see one another, the way we treat one another, the way we should be welcoming one another and treating the earth and make sure everybody has the right toward everything basic. Therefore, to do that in a vision of nonviolence, sort of connected what we were just talking about. You can't have justice and economic justice and environmental justice and nuclear weapons and a global military with all that trillions of dollars going into war at the same time. You need that money to bring justice and peace to ordinary people so that no one is fleeing anywhere. Everybody has what they need, especially as the world gets worse. So it's another reason why we have to work for the abolition of war itself and nuclear weapons, to heal the poor and welcome the poor and treat every human being with dignity as their sister and brother and Mother Earth and the creatures. It's a vision of nonviolence that we all have to be talking about from now on. What do you think, Joan?
Well, I'd like to hear from Jorge on that one too. I have some thoughts, but I'd like to hear Jorge too.
I think I'm going to rely, honestly, what I don't know, you don't know, I don't know. So I'll be very honest, and I will have to say that this is an area that I'm still learning. My experience as an immigrant, has given me some background, but I recognize that for the last 10 years living in Miami, most of my work has been with migrant workers and the food insecurity that they face. So that's where most of my energy has been. Clearly, you all have been granted not only the opportunity, but this beautiful sense of calling to be more connected to, other intricacies that at the moment I feel a bit separated from. So I think I'm gonna pass on the time to perhaps someone that can add a little more to the conversation.
I'll jump
Yeah,
in.
go for it.
Knowing the irony that Jorge just pointed out about how he's working with farm workers who have food insecurity, who are picking the food that we have, right? Yeah, I've had the blessing and the struggle of being able to go down to the border, especially down in El Paso over the last year, lead various trips down there, build some great relationships with folks like Ava Moya and the folks at Abada. And just amazing churches down there that are on the front lines of immigration down on the southern border. And the stuff that we're seeing in those realities is, just thousands and thousands, if not millions of people, both on the US side of the border and on the Mexico side of the border in the most desperate situations you can encounter. I mean, I worked in a couple of different churches down there, Sagrado Corazon, St. Francis Xavier, that those churches are, functioning as basic churches for the day of mass or for their services, but then they're entirely migrant shelters. I mean, imagine every room converted in your church to a clothing closet, a food bank, a shelter where people are sleeping. It is an overwhelming situation. And we've been fortunate enough at First Presbyterian Church. Just this past month, we took in a Venezuelan family to live at our church. This family was dropped off in the middle of Santa Fe in the middle of a snowstorm right before Christmas with nothing but the clothes on their back. They had a 15-month-old baby with them who was extremely sick and needed to get to a doctor. We housed them at the church for the last 6 weeks in a form that was very reminiscent of the sanctuary movement of the 1980s with El Salvador and Guatemala migrants coming to the United States. And so we have to look critically at what's causing this migration too. I mean, you look at Venezuela, obviously you have the corruption and the violence of the Maduro government. You have the collapse of the oil economy that's tied into Venezuela, right? They're sitting on one of the biggest, if not the biggest oil reserves in the world, and yet one of the poorest places in the world. But you also have to look at UN sanctions. I mean, UN sanctions have been backbreaking to the people of Venezuela. So right now at the southern border of our country, you have, 7 million Venezuelans have left since 2014. That's a quarter of the population of Venezuela is in immigration. In 2021, that country had 90% of the people in poverty. They're making $4 a month in Venezuela in 2021 was the average, 90% of the population was there. So we got to look at really critically at what's causing people to migrate. Much of it is our own policies. Much of it is our own problem. And then what do? When they get to the United States, we set up a giant border wall with all kinds of barbed wire. You all are following this in the news, razor wire everywhere, Humvees outside of it. And we treat people who are in the most desperate scenarios as non-human beings and as enemy combatants. And the language and the rhetoric around it, and you'll see this, is around an invasion, right? And it's intended to dehumanize, to militarize people who are this family with their 15-month-old baby just coming in the most desperate situation. She left because she was a teacher and tried to get union rights and better pay and better health care. And for that, the government came against her and threatened her life. And she was forced to flee across numerous countries to ultimately end up here in the United States with a newborn baby. These stories are biblical. I mean, they're so common. When I was working down in the shelters down there, I met a father of 3 kids. He had a 7-year-old daughter, a 5-year-old daughter, and a newborn. And they were all at the shelter, but the mom was nowhere to be found. The mom had been detained. She was in one of our ICE facilities. The whole family was on the other side, on the U.S. side, but the baby couldn't be breastfed. So here I am at a shelter watching mothers at a migration shelter all take this father's baby and breastfeed this baby, just like a wet nurse out of Exodus and Moses. And I'm watching all of these mothers try to care for this baby so this baby could have breast milk and not die because the mother was in detention. And so these scenarios are incredibly common. These are, heartbreaking stories. And what you're saying, John and Joan, about kind of dehumanizing people and not looking at the realities of where they're coming from and why they're coming from, where they're coming from, and what the U.S.'s role in that is incredibly problematic, I think. I always remind churches that are just north of El Paso, I said, these waves of migration are coming. Denver's got 40,000, mostly Venezuelans living in the city of Denver now. Santa Fe has, Venezuelans, Albuquerque's got Venezuela. It's, this is not just a border issue. This is a United States. And how do we, deal with our Statue of Liberty saying, give us your poor and your huddled masses, right? And so I think we really have to come back to looking at that. A lot of you all know I'm a wildlife guy. When you build border walls and razor wire that's 30 feet in the air, you're dealing with jaguars and ocelots and black bears and all kinds of birds and, desert pronghorn, and, Sonoran pronghorn, desert bighorn sheep that can't move. They can't find mates. They can't find food because there's no genetic viability for their mates because they're on the other side of the wall. And so we're not just breaking apart human communities. I mean, we're breaking apart wildlife communities. We're breaking apart naturally God's order when we're building these walls and putting up these giant razor wire fences that animals can't move across. The intention is not humans to move across. And it's creating all kinds of injustices and bigger disturbances in the system. And Joan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because, to me, it's obviously something I'm passionate about, but it's a huge issue and we've got to connect these dots, as John was saying.
Right, right. And, with that, one of the things, and Jorge, you mentioned the farm workers, and I just keep thinking, one of the huge considerations is food insecurity and water insecurity around the world, which are increasing dramatically with climate change, but also disruption of people and where they live, their governments, because of conflict and wars and weaponization of people, which is part of the profit of the military industrial complex. So I think we just need to keep working to shift our worldview, and at some deep levels. I mean, even to use anymore, I try to help people not use the word poor or poverty, but it's economic inequities is what it really is. We need to look deeper, I think, into some systems. I just still remember talking to some men from Central America on the border, because I've gone down there to do some volunteer work also. They were with their children. And I said, well, why are you here? And he said, well, we haven't been able to grow a crop for 4 years because of the drought. I've been to the UN Copenhagen, to the UN climate meetings rather, and heard people from around the world saying, we just want our seasons back, or as the glaciers melt, we're not going to be able to grow any food. And when I was living on the border, which I did for a while, I still remember one article that was way back in the newspaper. And the military was doing maneuvers on the border in New Mexico. And they were planning with the maneuvers what they would do if there was an invasion of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, if not thousands, at one time, just rushing across the border, because they didn't have enough to eat or there was no water to drink. And so with that, I think we need to really go deeper in how we respond. And a lot of times with immigration that happens, we're very good as people of faith to do the charity work, which we need, but we need to look into the systemic and even patriarchism. I think a lot of policies that are being made do not include women. And most climate policies, even in the countries where this needs to be happening, they are not at the table. So there's a whole element of women's wisdom and women's voices of people of various cultures and races, and their voices are not there. These decisions, these things are being made at without many voices that could really help us and shift the paradigm and how we're living with each other and making decisions.
All right. Well, I've got the final question for us, and this is the $1 million question. So how do we stay spiritually grounded, hopeful, and faithful when things feel like they're going to hell in a handbasket? Obviously, we've been talking about some hard issues today, but I would love to open that up. Father John, what are your thoughts on how do you stay hopeful, and grounded and faithful when things are feeling like they are in the world today?
Right. Thank you. And thank you all so very much for your reflections and for welcoming me. We surrender our lives to the God of peace, and as Christians to the nonviolent Jesus, and say, okay, from now on, whatever you want, I will do. And we do that together, and we have built communities of peace and nonviolence together, so we're not alone. We have keep friends, and we go deeper into our oneness with creation and our awareness and mindfulness, as you were speaking of the beautiful creatures and the wonders of creation, as well as all of the beautiful human beings on the planet. Then we double our efforts towards movement building. Maybe 50 years ago, Sister Joan and I might have been talking about the church if we were doing a Zoom, and I had not said a word about that. And I think that nowadays, the future, because if we want to bring humanity back from the brink, we all are needed. We need to all be involved in the grassroots, bottom-up people power movement. That's how change happens. I was always interested in hope and what does it mean? Martin Luther King never talked about it his whole life. I think it's because everything he did worked. He didn't need hope. Worse than then, he started speaking against the Vietnam War, and all hell broke loose, and he knew he was going to be killed. And the first time in his life, in the last 2 or 3 weeks of his life, he started talking about hope. And he, in Memphis, a few nights before he was killed, again, he announced his definition of hope. Martin Luther King said, hope is the final refusal to give up. We're not going to give up. We're going to keep going and do what we can, do our bit for our sisters and brothers in need, for creation, and together we're going to, whether we live to see the positive change we want or not, we're going to leave the outcome in God's hands, but do what we can. And then one other thought on that is, here in Santa Fe, just before he died, my friend was the historian Howard Zinn. He wrote a book called A People's History of the United States. And he was here down the road. We were having lunch and he's saying, all the movements in history, I suddenly realized, because he invented the study of movements, were hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. I said, thanks, Howard. And then he said, and I realized then there was always a breakthrough. Why? The abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor movement of the 30s, the civil rights movement, and then the beginning of the women's movement, the environmental movement, all these now thousands of movements, which now have to deepen in every way and connect. Why? Because ordinary people kept at it and did their 1, 2, 3 things every day, no matter what, to stand up against all this injustice, the systems of violence and death and destruction of the earth, whether they were going to live to see it or not. And that's how nonviolence can become contagious and bring about the changes that have happened, that shouldn't have happened, with impossibilities. And we could talk about that up through apartheid, the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism, and all the 85 nonviolent revolutions of the last 40 years alone. So there is hope if we dedicate ourselves and work together in through people power to call for the coming of a new culture of nonviolence.
Sister Joan, what are your thoughts, or Jorge, what are your
I'll
all
jump
thoughts on
into
that?
this because I just had a combined class with my science teacher with our 4th and 5th graders, and we were talking about Mandela, right? And they were pretty much introduced to who he was, his cause, and why the students keep asking questions, but why did he chose to stay in prison? They couldn't understand why someone would advocate and make a decision to stay in prison in order to bring awareness to a very complicated issue, right? And so that brought me back to this concept. One of the biggest questions that I've had as I work with kids, you know, it's easy for us adults to engage in these very complex conversations and dialogues, but how do we set the foundation for future generations, for our children, to have a sensitivity towards this? Because what we all have learned so far is that hatred is learned, you know, prejudice is learned. But what are the things that we're doing to really set the path in a different way? And even though I work with kids and I work at an Episcopal school, the truth is that I work with very affluent people, right? And I've tried to be very responsible on how do I take advantage of this opportunity, because I know for a fact that my students will be people that hopefully they will be able to move in ways that perhaps others can't, right? And so I always introduce them to the teachings of Jesus, because I don't know if they're gonna perhaps have an encounter where they perhaps realize that Christianity is their spiritual path. However, introducing them to the concepts of meditation, mindfulness, breath work, show them how all the spiritual traditions point out to the beauty of our shared humanity, and how when we operate from that space, we create an opportunity for better dialogues and better conversations, is something that has really been driving my conversations with my students and the work that I do with all these families. Because the longer we stay operating from a reactive place, we are constantly operating out of that ego mind that leaves zero room to recognize our shared humanity with the others, and how our needs are as valid as the need of those who perhaps we don't even know. But to create that space in which we recognize that We all know what hunger is. We all know what suffering is. We all know what despair is. Yet it is in our hands, you know? And so I am missing who is it, and you beautiful theologians and spiritual leaders can help me remember this. But there's a beautiful spiritual leader that says, I think it was Julia of Norwich, God has no hands but yours hands. God has no feet but your feet, you know? And so I think we have such a beautiful, rich opportunity to model to our children how, instead of living in a reactive mode, we can operate from a place of centeredness, and we can act from a place of connection with our shared humanity and the energy of love, the spirit that we all share, that anime, that it's in permeating creation in the universe. Those are my 2 cents as we bring our conversation to a closure.
And Jorge, thank you, because I'm going to jump in with that as well, which is kind of where I was coming from also, that it's a spiritual practice, and a spiritual practice is like meditation, breath work, prayers, all of that, but it also has to be rooted in earthiness. And how we live the flesh and blood. And I find that young people are really taken with that. And that includes like planting a seed, growing food, seeing the miracle of that. You know, walks of awe and wonder of beauty, and seeing the beauty be that not is just all around us, but is flowing within us and through us. I mean, water is 70% of who we are. The breath is there. I mean, we're all this beauty and the wonder and awe. And so I think this spiritual rootedness to shift a worldview in a positive way, and to move forward in a rooted way. Another one, like I bake sourdough bread because there is a miracle in these wild yeasts that are out there. And it reminds me that there's a potential of shifting anything and of it moving to a new place any instant. And we don't even know what that is. And that there's that possibility there, and that miracle. And sometimes I think we think of ourselves as too small, but we are an expression of the universe. And all of this is an evolutionary path. And all that seems like it's good or bad is not good or bad. It is things that are happening. And it's part of coming to this greater unity with God, with the holy, and with love. And so I was on a call just last week on some difficult issues we're dealing with at the legislative session, and really hard, and trying to deal with conflicts, and then bills that this bill that keeps getting watered down, that has great impact on the earth and people here. And somebody was bemoaning, and they said, oh, well, I do this work for the big bucks, quote. And I just said, well, I do this because I'm ordained by the universe. And each of us are ordained. We're all ordained by the universe. And that is the Holy One of love breathing through every single cell, atom, element. And that's what we're called to. What an amazing, great dignity we have, and what beauty that is. And I think young people long for those kind of messages. And then that kind of rootedness then finds an expression in addressing these difficult challenges of violence, of war, of climate change that are around us, because we're coming with all of this that is there, and that we're not alone in it. We're never alone. Our community is vast. It's all the plants, the birds, the creatures, the people. And we're entangled. We're entangled with one another. Here on this call today, we will be entangled forever because of the energies. I mean, we're connected now. So we're all doing this together. So I just think that there's just amazing places to hold, to begin with, to be part of in this. And yeah, Jorge, I agree, from coming from that place, not in a naive way, but that's foundational to all of this hard work that we're part of. Sometimes what I call, we're engaged in creative suffering. That's part of it as well. But I just thank you all for your insights and being in this conversation.
I'll just close with, I find a lot of hope in getting out on the landscapes and finding what holds people together and finding common ground on common ground. I mean, I obviously work on protecting all kinds of places all over the United States. On the call today, you have Brophy Toledo from Jemez Pueblo and Carmichael Dominguez, who's a northern New Mexico Hispanic, and here I am, a white guy, all born and raised in New Mexico, working together to protect the same landscape, understanding our cultures, our traditions, our spiritualities, breaking bread together. And that's rare, right? That's rare in this culture and climate. In New Mexico, even that's very rare. And so it's really incredible to be able to work with those folks, learn from, Brophy and Carmichael and other folks that are working on these issues and finding the common ground on the common ground. And the last thing I would say is I learned a lot from kids that I was working with in El Paso at the shelters. These are kids that have migrated from Venezuela and El Salvador and Guatemala. Migrant children have taught me a lot as a spiritual leader. And the folks at UTEP did a study where they studied what is it about the children that are migrating and what are their values and what are they experiencing. And so they had a PhD student go down in the middle of the journey and interview kids and families. And they found 3 common things from these migrant kids and families. The first was how important mothers are and how important it is to have parents that care for these kids and give them comfort and care in the middle of suffering and struggle and injustice. And that sense of community, Father John, is what those kids were feeling. The second thing, though, that really stuck out to me was the importance of faith. These kids believed that God was with them on the journey, that God wasn't going to abandon them, that God was going to help protect them and watch over them, that God was fundamentally with them every step that they took. And this was true of 3 and 4-year-olds and 8 and 9 and 12 and 13-year-olds. And UTEP found that their faith was incredible to make this journey. And fundamentally, they found that they had hope for a better life and hope for a more just world. And that's what kept these kids going. And so here I am, a pastor, thinking about, we always think about what are the immigrants taking from us and the invasion and all this rhetoric and nonsense that you find in the framing of this issue. Well, we're forgetting what they bring to us. And that sense of faith and hope from, out of the mouths of babes literally is alive. And in this country, we have the privilege to debate whether we should practice this religion or whether we should believe in God or whether we should practice this faith or that. And we get into all these academic and theoretical discussions around this. And for those kids, faith is a matter of survival. It is what is getting them up and getting them going and taking that step in their journey every day. And so for me, it's a reminder that, that is a privileged perspective of whether I need God in my life and I need faith that given day. And so I'm constantly learning from migrant children about how to grow my own spirituality and coming back and seeing those blind spots of privilege. And that gives me a lot of hope. It's a reminder that, from the youngest and most marginalized in the world, you can learn a tremendous amount of wisdom and understanding about God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. And we need that. And if we don't think we need that, we're foolish. And we've got those blind spots. So with that said, I really want to thank Father John Deere for being with us. It is awesome to be in your presence. It's awesome to be in your presence, Sister Joan and Jorge. Really thank all of the people who joined us today. We're going to make this recording available online. So once we have it uploaded to the cloud, we'll be able to download it back from the cloud and be able to put it up online and be able to share that with you all. We'll do that through the Earth Keepers newsletter. We'll also send it to Father John. You can share it with others and Sister Joan and Jorge as well. So really grateful for you all. Hope this was a helpful webinar. Hoping that we'll do many more of these conversations through Earth Keepers as well in the future. And just want to thank you all for your work and your witness. And really, again, thank Father John for making time to be with us and for all your amazing work and the bigger vision that you have. So thank you. All right. Blessings to you all.